There you go.
Oh, sorry about that. Good morning. I would like to thank the chairman for accommodating our wishes to be in the morning session. And I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. My name is Scott Mason. I'm the executive director of the department. We have a very simple mission statement. As guardian of the state's fish, wildlife, and marine resources, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department works in partnership with the public to conserve, manage, protect these resources and their habitats, inform and educate the public about these resources, and provide the public with the opportunity to use and appreciate these resources. We provide the state with many services. Everything from search and rescue, public wildlife education, and sampling moose for COVID, just a few. We have ongoing research on many wild species in New Hampshire, from the White Mountain
Fertility.
to lobsters. We constantly review and adjust our rules to manage New Hampshire's wildlife and marine resources. The department has 7 divisions. Our business division, which deals also with OHRV registrations, license sales, and fleet management. Public Affairs Division, which is conservation communication, conservation education, aquatic resources education, hunter ed. Facilities and Land Division facilitates construction and maintenance, boat access program. Inland Fisheries, freshwater fish management, fisheries habitat, and our hatchery, Great Bay National Estuary Research Reserve and the Great Bay Discovery Center. Our Wildlife Division runs our game programs, our non-game programs, and our wildlife habitat programs. You've also received a handout on our funding, and I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Labonte, Chief of the Business Division. Been with the department many years. And what I handed out is a snapshot of the last several years of all of the various pots that make up the unrestricted fish and game fund, from licensing to miscellaneous sales. The 2 highlighted numbers in the fiscal year 23, which is the current fiscal year we're in, of course, are actual figures that have been transferred into the Fish and Game Fund from the OHRV and Marine unrefunded road toll. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have about our unrestricted revenue. I would like to say where we are right now is we are slightly ahead of budget for fiscal year 23, but we are under where we were performing a year ago.
Okay. Can you guys, you can go send the first.
Good morning. So I'm from Nashua, but even so, we do have snowmobilers in the area who really love the sport. And I hear their frustration about the online registration. And I know that there's a September 1st, 25 deadline for implementing online registrations. They're frustrated that the commission is only planning to commit to renewals, and we've just appropriated another $20,000 from fiscal. So I'm just wondering, what is it going to take? Do you have the resources to be able to do even registration, first-time registrations online by the statutory deadline of September 1st, 25?
How do you want to handle that, Director?
Go ahead, Kathy.
OHRV, of course, is dedicated revenue, so it has no role in the unrestricted fish and game fund. We are on course to open up our online registration by the date that is in law, September of '25, and that will be for renewals only. At this point in time, we have no capacity, no plan to have new registrations online at that time. This process is extremely complicated and time consuming. It's not just a monetary resource that is required, it's a people resource. And it is at least a year of user acceptance testing once the program is actually developed by our online developer. It's not as easy as pressing a button and having this program readily available for people to be able to register their machines. And the idea of doing renewals only, at first, certainly, not forever, but at first is all of that renewal information will be in the system so that when people go in and register their machine, it will come up populated with all of their information. We're going to take the steps slowly that are required to ensure that we offer a really good system to our constituents.
I have no doubt that you will offer a really good system, but you still have 2.5 years or almost 2.5 years. And aren't you using a contracted vendor
We are.
to build this system?
We are using, at this point, we are waiting on paperwork for an amendment to our existing contract that we have currently for online licensing and OHRV registrations that our agents use. When that paperwork comes back, we will provide governor and council with that packet and hopefully have it approved. We did go to fiscal and ask for the finances to fund that. And that will get the project going with the online vendor. It will be months, several months before that system would even be available for us to test.
Well, if I could just comment, I mean, the commission reads the statutory language as allowing this to start with renewals only, but I don't think the fiscal committee does, and I don't think the legislature did either. So, thank you.
So my question was along the same lines. Originally was, I was concerned, looking at one of the reports you gave out, and we're seeing a decrease in OHRV registrations by, 7,800 in a given year. We're over 45,320, it looks like, to, for snowmobile registrations alone, down to 37,000 from 45,000. So the question I have is whether or not the online registration would fix this. My understanding is that people can choose to go wherever they want. They can go to Maine and register instead if it's easier and they're going to Maine anyway, rather than be able to register in New Hampshire. Whereas if they register in New Hampshire, they'll be able to take their snowmobile to Maine and still work, and we get the benefit of the revenue, not Maine. So I'm just a little concerned about that, and I think that an online registration process, and like Senator Rosenwald, when I read the statute, I don't see it says online only. It says online registration. I suppose you could interpret it to mean only renewals or that renewals meets their qualifications. But like her, I would think that it's registration. If I've got to register my vehicle for the first time, I still got to register it, and I should be able to do it online. So I would think that the way I read the statute is the second way, which is registration means if I want to register it, I should be able to register it, whether it's a first time or a renewal. So
The history of the discussion at the committee meeting where the amendment was made, it started off as renewals only. We agreed with the Snow Machine Association to change it to online registration so that we wouldn't have to go back to the legislature seeking permission to then do new registrations. The system we're proposing, we're actually following the system that Maine did, is they started with just online renewals first. It makes it a lot easier. There's less there's less mistakes made, so that we can separate them. We know we're going to get more mistakes on online new registration. So separating that, let's make sure we get the system up and running first, and then we can manage, and then we'll try to manage the the informational mistakes that our customers make.
So I have a different question. We'll move on. Just talk about the revenues you have listed here. Ca- What is where are you seeing the biggest declines when it comes to, I'm looking at, 2020 seemed to be, and I know that was a pandemic year. But 2020, your actuals are at 15.5 and we're down to 24 and it's 13.3. So we're seeing a significant reduction in revenues. And how do we account for that? Why are we accounting for that?
We have a significant reduction in licensing. If you look at fiscal year 20 and 21 actuals, they were considerably higher than budgeted. And that was due to the pandemic. There were more and more people going out. There were families going out. We have absolutely seen a decline since the end of the pandemic, and everyone has gone back to work. Everyone has gone back to school. The other significant increase in revenues just for that year was miscellaneous sales and income at $958,000. That was due to the sale of our Brentwood Farm facility over in Brentwood, where we used to raise pheasants. So we sold that during fiscal year 20, and the proceeds were deposited into this account. Everything else in the categories seem to be right on par with about where we budgeted. But licensing was the big, we had about $3 million over budgeted for those 2 fiscal years in licensing.
So my last question is, so on 23, your budgeted was 13.7. I think I heard you say you're above those projections right now?
I was strictly talking about licensing because that's our biggest pot of money in the unrestricted. And we are on par, slightly over with where we are budgeted at this same time last year. We are below where our actuals were at this time last year. So we're on par with budget.
Okay.
We're below where our actuals were. That's at the end of March.
So 22. So we're talking about you're comparing to the
No.
14.8 number where you are today compared to that 14.8 number, and you're behind the 14.8 number, right? You're selling less. We agree there's a decline. The question is how much of a decline, right?
Correct.
But you're also above the 13.7 number.
I'm only strictly
Or you're
talking.
predicting you're going to be above the 13.7, or you think you're going to be hitting that number?
I am only talking about license revenue.
Okay.
So we will be at the 13.7. I would say that we will be right about at 13.7. We will make budget this year.
Okay. So there was one.
Thank you. Do you have a sense, well, our license revenues are declining, the states and the Canadian province around us that do have online registration, do you have a sense of what their license revenues have been doing over the period, since 2020?
That's two different programs. This is licensing, and I believe that you're referring to online OHRP.
The registration. Oh, okay.
Two
So this
different
is like hunting and fishing licenses.
And the only state that has new registrations available online is Maine. There are no other states in the vicinity that have new OHRV registrations available online. They are renewals only.
Only
In-
Maine.
In Maine, recently implemented that. They did renewals only for several years prior to offering new registrations online.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think some of the variation, if I may continue, Senator Rosenwald, some of the variation we see, I think the changes in snow levels and whatnot are probably having a bigger impact on, especially on out-of-state registrations. The group of snowmobilers, you mentioned it, Senator Lang, people can go wherever they want until they either purchase a camp, and if they purchase a camp, they tend to head towards their camp and whatnot. So it's let me call them a transient group of tourists that can, they're gonna be staying at a hotel, or they're gonna be staying at a campground or something like that, and snow machining out of that. Oh, that's the group that will tend to change where they're headed. And over the last few years, our snowfall levels in northern New Hampshire have not been the greatest. We did not have the best snowfall this year for snow machining. We finally did get some snowfall later on. I was speaking to a gentleman whose son rented a cabin in Pittsburgh for the month of, I think it was December. And he went once, was able to go snow machining once. So that plays a role in it, and I believe northern Maine probably is getting a little bit more snow than we've gotten in the last few years. So changes in registration, I think that's a big part of it.
Nice to see both of you. It's an annual occurrence. You know, the saltwater license, we took a bath there. I remember that controversy, and it was, we gave up almost $500,000 worth of revenue when we made the move not to sell the saltwater license. I was around at that time. Give me that story.
We do sell a saltwater license.
Well,
What occurred and what you're looking at as far as the pots of money,
Right.
it used to have its own receipt account and be separated out for the first several years that we offered the saltwater license, so that
Right.
we could track that separately.
okay,
Back in 2016, we merged the saltwater license with the pot of money called licensing. I mean, we track it internally,
okay,
but not in its own separate receipt account. So we absolutely sell the saltwater
okay,
license.
good. So the zeros are bogus.
It is completely bogus.
Okay,
So in a couple years from now, when the columns way off on the right drop off, saltwater license will be gone.
the the unfunded road toll, the marine unfunded road toll. Are these for 23? Are these actuals?
Yes, that's why they're highlighted. That's actual transfers that were deposited.
Okay, so why are we predicting a downturn for the next biennium?
It's not so much a prediction as it is being conservative. We know at this point in time, our OHRV revenues are significantly lower than they were a year ago, as the director just spoke to. It really is because of the snowfall.
Yes.
So the OHRV road toll is directly related to the registrations sold. And I tend to budget more on the conservative side than the optimistic side. I would rather be a little bit over than short-handed.
But that's okay, but that's a fairly significant drop. I mean, you're going from $1 million to 800,000. That's a $200,000 drop. That's pretty heavy. Yeah, that's a big number. And you're looking at that for both years.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If you're more comfortable, I mean, we could up it a little bit. I wouldn't
Well,
want to
I-
up it to $1 million. I think
Yeah.
that that's being a little too optimistic.
Well, I want to be realistic, and you went from in 21 from 800,000 to $1 million, so you had that big increase. Was that because you budgeted conservatively?
No, I've always had it budgeted at the 800,000.
So and then you saw a pop.
Now,
A
the
$200,000
fiscal year
increase.
20 and 21 are actuals. Of course, these are all actual figures.
Well, what I'm saying is, I'm looking at 21 and looking at 22, and there's a $200,000 gain. Right, you went from 870 to 1 billion. So
Absolutely,
anyway, those
absolutely.
are big variances. So if if you tell me that the variance is because you budget conservatively, then I would say, budget realistically.
As is the same with license sales in 20 and 21, OHRV sales were considerably higher as well because people were out on every type of machine available to them. So the money that is deposited in 23 is actually from fiscal year 22 sales. Money deposited in 22 is from fiscal year 21 sales. So we anticipate that to be a little down. Now, certainly, Senator, if you feel that that number should be made a little higher, we can work with the LBA to increase it.
Okay, as I said, I've been listening to you for a number of years. I just want you to be realistic with us. That's, I mean, we've, in the past, we've never done this, right? The only time you've appeared is before the finance committee. So now I'm looking at the numbers and appreciate your good work and longevity, and so you've been with a lot of executive directors. So I'm just saying that if you want to be, give me some numbers that are realistic, because based on these numbers, we got other things to do. And if the numbers are better and there's a little more money, that gives us an opportunity to do more on the spend side.
Okay.
So I
I'm
guess,
optimistic. I'm an optimist.
given the senator's comments, I guess I have a question. So on those last two lines, and given the historical precedent of those lines, would you look at the OHA unfunded roll toll and think 950 would be a reasonable estimate versus the 850? 950? Given the historical precedent of the last 2 years? Still below what the last 2 years were, accounting for a slight drop, but not.
I would be hard pressed to budget that in fiscal year 24, only because I have actual revenue of what has come in fiscal year 23 through the end of March. And we are in revenue overall for the program, we're at 1.2 million less than we were a year ago. So that is significantly less registrations sold, and it is 100% correlated to the lack of snowfall in the North Country.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand. I thought those two highlighted columns, the OHRV and the Marine unfunded road toll lines,
There, Senator.
highlight items with the
These
actual.
are actual, I'm talking about what will come in fiscal year 24 will be based on sales for fiscal year 23.
So what Kathy's saying is registrations are down in 23. Therefore, gas usage will be also down in 23. Therefore, when we get our 24 allotment of road toll, it'll be based off of probably less usage.
That's correct.
So that was all.
Thank you. I'm a little confused now. For fiscal year 23, it's listed as budgeted.
The two highlighted numbers are actual.
So it's not budgeted. It's
Correct.
actual. Okay.
Correct.
So what was the budget?
The budget was exactly the same. It was the 800,000 for OHRV and 900,000 for Marine.
Okay, so we should just change the column heading from fiscal year 23 budgeted to fiscal.
Every other figure.
All of the other figures are budgeted.
Okay.
So I guess my question was the same for the next line, the Marine. You put 900, we're at 1.1 million, we're at over 1 million the previous year, and over 1 million the previous year before that. So I guess my question is, would you accept $1,050,000 for that line as an increase, $150,000 increase on that line for revenues?
Okay.
Okay. Any further questions for Fish and Game? Thank you, guys.
I actually had an area where you could increase.
Okay, where would that be?
That would be interest on savings deposits.
Okay, it's at 25,000 right now.
Correct, because interest was so low, we have been experiencing much greater interest performance on the fishing game fund as of late. I would be comfortable putting that up to about 150.
From 25?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. I am actually getting proceeds from, I'm being honest with you, I'm getting interest proceeds from Treasury at this point of about $40,000 a month.
And what does that do in 25, do you think? Same number or
And maybe stick with 125, because we're not quite sure where that's gonna go.
appreciate your honesty in that. Thank you, guys. Next up, we have liquor. Sir.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Joseph Malika, Chairman of the New Hampshire Liquor Commission, and with me is our CFO, Tina Demers. The package you have in front of you, we'll run through for you. So on page 2, you'll see that those are the 17 control states after Prohibition in 1934. States were allowed to make the decision to go open or controlled, and obviously New Hampshire is a control state. On page 3, you'll see the 3-tier system: manufacturer, wholesale, broker, and retailer. We are committed to and believe in the 3-tier system. On page 4, you'll notice the values of the 3-tier system, and one of the number 4 is something that's really come to mind recently: product tracking, prevents sales of tainted and counterfeit product, which has become a huge issue in Europe and other countries. Not so much in this country at this point, but obviously people have found ways to make a lot of counterfeit product. And you've noticed in the news over the years, people being poisoned by alcohol, which is in fact tainted or not produced properly. And that source is through the NABCA 3-tier system, which we are a member of. That's the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association. On page 5, the quick introduction is that the Liquor Commission is self-funded. It's a separate fund outside of the general fund, and no general fund appropriations are used to maintain our operations. The commission generated $771 million in net sales in '22. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see that we're governed by RSA 176:3. On page 6 is an organizational structure of the Liquor Commission. And at the bottom of the page, it's important to note, even with the adding of 28 positions, salary and benefits are decreasing in FY24 as a result of reductions in part-time and overtime budgets. FY23 authorized positions are 343 plus the new 28 for a total of 371 full-time positions. On page 7 is the breakdown of the divisions and the responsibilities: Office of the Commission, Division of Enforcement, Division of Administration, and the Division of Marketing and Merchandising, and a description for each. On page 8, you'll note the competition that the Liquor Commission works with and works against every day. So Total Wine is the biggest independent wine and spirits retailer in the United States. They moved into Massachusetts in 2016 when the caps were lifted on licenses. They have 245 stores in 27 states, 11,000 employees. They have 10 stores in New England and 7 stores in Massachusetts. And of course, that's important to us because 50% of our business here at the New Hampshire Liquor Commission comes from cross-border sales. So we're always interested in what's happening in New England because it's important to our revenue. On page 10, our marketing goals. Obviously, our major marketing goal is to bring the best products and values to our customers through a positive shopping experience. And the rest are listed there. On page 11, you'll notice our web and e-commerce. We have over 125,000 visitors a month to our website. We started curbside and in-store pickup during the pandemic as part of our next-gen system and implementation. We brought it forward. And since 2020, we've garnered $7.6 million in revenue to date since the implementation. And you can see the top 3 stores, Salem, West Lebanon, and Northampton for curbside and in-store. On page 12, just a couple of quick outlines of our flyers, our monthly sale flyers. You can see Martha there and Dale Earnhardt Jr. Our in-store displays and marketing are an important piece. Obviously, we've added wine to go, chilled wine, etc. But big, impactful displays are what people come to New Hampshire. People come to New Hampshire to basket build and to bulk buy. We're an outlet. It's in our name, and that's what we do. Our monthly sales it's a cohesive design and reinforcement. So the sale is usually a 15% off sale of a certain category. And a couple of times a year, we'll do all of Europe, all of the United States. But it's a cohesive design that goes along with it. On page 14, you'll see our social media and email programming, our Instagram followers, our Facebook likes, and our Twitter followers. Our email marketing, we have 200,000 recipients. We've gained close to 25,000 subscribers in 22 alone. And we send out 7 targeted emails a month out to our licensees, out to our consumers, and anyone that's signed up on our emails. So it's kind of a balance between sending too many and not sending enough. We found that 7 sort of hits the sweet spot. And on page 15, you'll see some brand building that we do. Our Keep It Local campaign supports New Hampshire wineries and distilleries. It's 15% off 3 bottles, and we have since moved it up to 20% off 3 bottles. It's worked very well. We have a great relationship with our in-state wineries and distilleries. On page 16, just some quick Google reviews, and a note that 91% of our reviews are 4 and 5 star. Between July 21 and June 22, we received 2,438 Google reviews. Just a good way to have consumers be able to tell us what we're doing right and what we might not be achieving as well as we should be. On page 17, the retail outlet locations. There's now 9 outlets that are state-owned, 59 that are leased, and there are 27 outlets with the curbside or in-store pickup. On page 18, the takeaway is that the top 15 stores do 51% of the business. That's the map on your left. And all other stores do 49% of the business. So a big bulk of the business comes from those top 15 stores. On page 19, you'll see the 3 agency store licenses that are here in the state. We have not issued an agency store license since '05. Obviously, Pittsburgh, Errol, and Greenville. Very small percentage of our business, just a little under $2.5 million. But important to those areas where they are, where the commission doesn't find it relevant to have a store, but to have alcohol available to the consumers. On page 20, you'll notice some outlet changes. Since 2012, we've renovated 40 outlets in 35 communities. This year, we opened a new store in Rindge, a new store in Concord on Exon 17, Manchester Gold Street. We're moving a store in Nashua across the parking lot in a plaza with Market Basket, and we're reopening a dairy store, which we had closed during the pandemic. On page 21, just a quick overview of the Rindge outlet. That was a relocation, again in the Market Basket Plaza, a move across the parking lot from an inline store to a freestanding, and you'll see the increase in sales of 19.6%. On page 22, Concord, Exit 17, it was a relocation. We closed the Fort Eddy store and we moved it to a brand new plaza in Concord with a Market Basket. And you'll see the increase in sales from the move was an increase of 2.9%. In Gold Street in Manchester, this is a brand new outlet. We had 2 outlets in the city. We didn't feel that it was enough. We didn't have enough coverage. We opened a new outlet on Gold Street next to the Walmart, busiest Walmart in New England. And you can see FY23 year-to-date sales are $4.8 million. We're very pleased with that store. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Tina to take you through the categories. Thank you.
Good morning. So on page 24, we show the breakdown for FY22 by our customer types and our categories, the spirits, wine, and accessories. You'll see that retail accounts for 72.7% of our business. Spirits are $383 million or 50% of sales, and the retail wine is $173 million or 22.6% of sales, with on-premise 11.3% and off-premise 15.5% of total sales. And then we provided pie charts that are broken down by the spirits and wine category by those customer types. On page 25 is our net profit history. The first chart shows the growth in the commission since it started in 1935. In the commission's 88 years of operation, it has earned over $4.3 billion in net profit. And then the other chart is the last 10 years of annual net profit from FY13 to 22, so that you can see the consistent trend. On page 26 is a 5-year revenue history by revenue sources. And on page 27, the revenue sources are described, which are beer tax and permits. That is 30 cents a gallon sold or transferred for retail sales or to the public from authorized licensees. Liquor and wine revenue, sales of wine, spirits, and accessories through outlets and the warehouse to retail customers. On-premise licensees, which are restaurants and lounges, and off-premise licensees, which is the grocery stores and the convenience stores. And then we have an other revenue category, which is primarily licensing fees. That's about $3.6 million, but also includes direct shipping permits of about $1.6 million, and then lottery and other miscellaneous revenue. Next is a 5-year history of revenue and expenses, and then there's the line in the middle, which is the net revenue transferred annually. It goes from $157.4 million in 2018 to $166.1 million in FY22. So on page 29, is the breakdown of the 5-year transfer history and estimates for FY23 to 25. There are 2 RSAs that govern revenue transfers prior to the transfer to the general fund, and those 2 RSAs are listed on the bottom of the next page. The first transfer requirement under RSA 176.16 is calculated into our plan since it's 5% of the previous year's gross profit, which is the first line item in the chart. And then that starts at about $6.8 million in FY18 and is estimated around $11 million in FY24 and 25. Then there's the RSA 126 AA3, and this is not in our revenue plan because it is the additional funds that are requested by HHS within a fiscal year for Granted Advantage, and that is shown as the next item, and that's FY 21, 22, and 23, which was 8.2, 8.7, and 7.2 million each year. Then we have beer tax, which is consistent around 13 million, and that leaves the remaining net revenue from liquor operations. The table on page 30 shows our sales, gross profit, and other revenue minus expenses for our net revenue on line 6. Then the 5% transfer to the alcohol fund to come to the revenue plan on line 8. For FY 22 and 23, there's the additional fund transferred to the Granted Advantage for the final transfer to the general fund on line 10. And the estimates we have for FY 24 and 25 are 135.9 million and 135.6 million. On page 31, our sales projections are dependent on staffing, and in our budget, we are requesting 24 new retail store clerk positions to support the stores. And on this page, we're showing you the history of our positions. The first chart is our authorized full-time position, showing the number of filled and vacant positions, and then the vacancy rate. And as you can see, this year is our highest vacancy rate at almost 12%. We're currently recruiting for 40 positions, with the majority of those in the stores. The second chart is the full-time equivalent based on part-time hours worked. And as you can see, we are down to 285 full-time equivalent. So for a comparison, when we had record sales in FY 21, we had a total of 670 full-time equivalent, and currently we have 588 full-time equivalent for a difference of 82 full-time equivalent employees. And this reduction in position has impacted sales and is the reason why store hours were reduced and stores were closed and or consolidated. So historically, the outlets have been supported by a fairly even mix of full-time and part-time staff. However, with the current trend of part-timers working less hours, we found the need to request additional full-time positions in our FY 24-25 budget to offset the decline in the part-time hours. So an initiative that we have also implemented to help increase sales is a retail employee incentive program. So if a region increases sales 0.5% to 5%, 10% of that increase will be distributed to all employees within that region. And page 32 and 33 is the language that we've requested to include in House Bill 2 to give the commission the opportunity to transfer funds from the liquor fund to the appropriate accounts to pay the qualified employees. So this will allow us to pay the incentive out of the additional profits from the increased sales. And then the remaining pages are our charitable contributions, awards, and accolades. And we would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, committee members with questions. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, great presentation. Really enjoyed the information.
Thank you.
Page 24. Could you
Yes.
give me an idea, if you happen to know, the relative profit margin for each type of customer type on that page?
Our profit margin has been consistent around 29%. 29.
29%.
Does it, follow up?
Yep.
Is it different for retail versus on-premise versus off-premise?
It's consistent for each category.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Roosevelt.
Thank you. So I'm trying to think ahead about the budget too. I see that your revenues went down in 22 versus 21 on page 28. from 175 million to 166. Your expenses went down a little bit too. But then when I look at your transfers to the general fund at the end of everything you have to send to the alcohol fund, if we remember that we are going to have to make a transfer to Granite Advantage of 7 or 8 or $10 million, why are your profits going down? And your revenues?
Well,
Are people drinking less?
well, of course, during COVID, you had a huge spike. And I think what we're experiencing now is the economy is affecting our business. People are spending more on fuel, more on food, more to heat their homes, and there's less income and there's less revenue to come to our stores and to basket build. So what we're seeing is the trend of people coming to the stores and buying better, but buying less. So that's what's affecting the sales right now. I think the economy is affecting the sales.
Could I follow? Thanks. But the rooms and meals tax, I mean, the food industry is doing pretty well.
They're doing
So
wonderful.
your
Yeah,
bar revenues should be holding up.
they're steady and they're on a slight increase. So but that's the major piece of our revenue is our retail. So the bars and restaurants are doing better, and we tend to see that the grocery stores are doing a little bit less. So, but because of the percentage of income that raises, it isn't raising the bar enough to make up the difference that you're losing in the retail end.
And part of it too is the staffing, not having the level of staffing in the stores, because each full-time equivalent employee we calculate does about $1 million annually in sales. So not having those additional employees in the stores to interact with the customers has had a significant impact on sales.
Could I ask one follow-up? What is your starting salary right now?
$12.63 an hour. Grossly low. Quite frankly, based across the industry and across retail, we're probably $4 to $5 less than we should be.
Can you raise that?
No, no, that's not something that we can do
Is that in the
independently.
collective bargaining agreement? Yeah, well, I guess that explains it.
I have just a couple of questions. So the House made a couple of changes to the projections. And I'm interested in your comments on those changes. For some reason, they increased gross profits by $1.5 million and from the governor's ask. And if you have a comment on how they came up with that new number. So I'm looking at page 30 of your presentation, and on the third line, which says gross profits from sales, the governor expected 230, and the House moved that up to 231.5. And so I'm interested in your comments on that.
So the House did the revenue plan, which is the 135.9 and the 135.6. So what we had to do, or what we did do, was adjust our sales and our gross profit to come to that revenue.
Okay.
And we're in line with it. We're okay with the plan numbers.
So the 135.9, you think is an attainable
Yes.
transfer to the general fund?
Yes, we do.
Further questions?
First of all, great presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. And, with the competition, we're lucky to be holding our own. Right? It's fierce out there. What's our average point of sale number from our stores?
It's around $48, Senator.
48?
48.
Years ago, I visited Pennsylvania. A friend of mine, a former state senator, was chairman of the commission there. and we do better than Pennsylvania, point of sale, and they have like thousands of outlets.
They do.
So,
They-
so really, I agree with Senator Rosen, Cindy, that the salary situation is problematic. But will the incentive package that you have put together, will that be, when will it be enacted, and B, how do you rate the success of that package?
Well, it was enacted in January, Senator. So January, February, March is the first quarter. We're doing a 90-day delay on the payment. So the first checks will go out to the employees in June. We had some good success with it. We're still running the numbers at this point. Is it going to make up the difference between what the employees should be being paid and what they are being paid? No, it's not. But it is an incentive program, and it does allow them, especially when we are staffed fully, to have that interaction with the customer and help the consumers find additional products to stay in the store longer and to spend more. That's the goal.
Right. So retention is a key issue.
Absolutely.
How will, if I might, what do you think the 10% wage increase in the first year? What, couple that with your incentive program, does that make it for a better situation?
I think it certainly makes a better situation, and I think it's certainly helpful. Given what we're paying and the incentive program, I still feel rather than the $3 or $4 to $5 short, we'll still be $2 to $3 short of where we should be.
Right.
We need to take a look at it because retail across the board, I mean, you see signs in front of every McDonald's starting between $17 and $18 an hour.
Right.
And let's not forget that these employees that work in these stores are lifting an average of 47-pound case 3 times to get it to the shelf.
Right.
And some of these stores get a full tractor trailer load delivery every day. They're moving thousands of pounds of product from the trucks, which we now have nearly all automated, to the storerooms, to the shelves, or to consumers' cars. It's a big ask.
Sure. Just one last thing, Mr. Chairman. On the negative side, the aberrant behavior that I've been witnessing to some extent around our stores, how are we dealing with that?
So in some areas, we are having some issues. We're dealing with, obviously, the local jurisdiction and our own enforcement, as well as we're looking into some private security in the stores on a more full-time basis.
Right.
So there is some areas where we do have some problems. But it's good to note that the shrink and the pilferage is still less than 0.5% of our gross sales. So we're well under the national average of about 2.8%.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Yes, sure. Shifting gears for 1 second. Beer tax looks really flat. Is that just an industry-wide? I mean, I happen to be a licensee. The cost of the product, the wholesale cost has gone through the roof in the last 2 years. I just wanted to know, from your impression, what's the trend on that? Do you see that changing at all, or is it going to stay? It's 13.2 million, give or take, every single year.
And it has been for years. There's been, I think there's been some reluctancy on the part to raise the tax, and I'm not a proponent or non-proponent of it. But it's come up in the legislature many, many times over the years and it's something that the legislature has not had the appetite to change. I think that's the only way you're going to really see it change because the price of beer has gone up, but the volume, the Budweisers, the Bud Lights, the beers that were in huge volume are now doing less business because a lot of the craft industry is charging more for the beer, but obviously based on a gallonage, you're getting less gallonage moved through than moving, hundreds of thousands of gallons of Budweiser or some yellow colored beer. So I think that's the trade-off why it's always seemed to stay around the same.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Oh, shoot. Thank you. I thought so.
They hit Powerball last night. Yeah, Ohio. Pardon?
So that retirement plan was shot.
Well, you call ahead, I'm kidding. Just on the record, I'm really kidding. As I say, if I could have done that, my mother would have won by, at some point. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Charlie McIntyre. I have the privilege of being director of the Hampshire Lottery. And with me this morning is our Chief Financial Officer, Jim Duras. There are two packets for you. One is a title page, and there's a few sheets behind it, as well as there's a second packet, which has a detailed explanation of all our games, how they work and how they operate, how they originated. I'm not going to go through that one. It's actually an excerpt from our annual financial report. But if you have any questions about games, it's probably answered in those pages. So starting with the first page, which is a XY graph axis, like this. It has what we want to describe as a condition existing in lottery called jackpot fatigue. There are 4 data points on the graph: Mega Millions jackpot size, Mega Millions sales, Powerball jackpot size, and Powerball sales. So if you can look at the graph itself, and you'll see the 2 blue peaks, those represent Mega Millions jackpot size. And the shaded in area that's green represents sales. And so we had a $1.3 billion Mega Millions jackpot in July of 2022, so this fiscal year. And we had sales at that week of $4.5 million. In January of 23, so the same fiscal year, we had a jackpot of $1.3 billion, and we had sales of under 2.5. And so what that shows is a condition we call jackpot fatigue, is that within the past fiscal year, on several occasions, we had anomalously high jackpots. And that's through no fault of anybody's other than the interest rate. The Federal Reserve, as they bump interest rates, bumps our jackpots simultaneously, because our jackpots are set by the amount of cash we have on hand. About 32 cents of every dollar goes to a jackpot fund. That fund is then multiplied by a bond factor, because a jackpot is paid out over 30 years, and that's the jackpot size. And so this year, because interest rates spiked, we had a large number of high jackpots to advertise. That has had the happy result of having a screamingly record year for jackpot games. We've done more this year than we ever have in our history for those 2 games, jackpot, Powerball and Mega Millions, by I think it's 18 million, and we still have 3 months left. So this year's revenue is anomalous, is sort of what I'm suggesting in terms of those 2 games. Moreover, Mega Millions and Powerball are our highest margin products. The state nets about 40 cents of every dollar we sell of Mega Millions and Powerball. So it's just literally an example of sort of where we made a lot of our money this year, as well as the impact that will have going forward and an understanding of where our revenue estimates going forward are. And the next page is our sports betting results since we launched. We have been tremendously successful for sports betting. We had an original revenue estimate of $10 million. This year, we have already netted $28.8 million state return. We're the number 2 jurisdiction in the country in terms of profitability per capita, only behind New York. And in many cases, we are 4 or 5 times more profitable than other states. So it's been tremendously profitable. The FY 2023 numbers are only through March, and they're unaudited. I would like to point out that the Bruins losing last night was super profitable for us, sadly. And if the Celtics could do the same, we'd be great. Because the Bruins haven't lost since like January. And so that's, they win, we lose. It's a rough thing for a Boston sports fan to be in this job. But certainly the impact of mass launching may have an impact on those revenues. And so we're trying to temper expectations. Like, I don't expect another year like this for profitability for sports betting. Listen, we're well going to exceed $30 million of profitability for the fiscal year for sports betting. Which leads us to our favorite graph, which is the distributions education. You will note the transfer for 2023 is $180 million. Jim and I are here to raise guidance on profit. We expect to transfer $180 million this year, which is $10 million more than we had estimated for the House in January, which is significantly more than the budget had accounted for. So we're raising guidance by $10 million for you folks, to $180 million for FY23.
I'm sorry, so it's $180 million for 2023?
Yes, yes,
Does
sir.
that just change your projections at all for 24, 25?
So it does not. Our projections based on our fear related to Powerball Mega Millions as well as sports betting are 158 and 163 million for 24 and 25. But for this year, because we are having everything seems to be working right. Like it's one of those, we step left and it's the right step. 180 million is which is, I mean, 10 years, well, when I first started this job, my first year was 62 million. So we've almost tripled revenues to the state in 12 years. So I'm hard pressed to sort of even continue the growth because as you see, it's been what you would characterize as hockey stick growth. And so the last slide, the last page would be essentially our income and expense statement. And those are the direct sales based off of each product category, as well as the expenses therein. Article 6B of the Constitution directs our revenue. It's very simple. It's our revenues minus our expenses equals return to education trust fund. And so that is where our revenues come from as well as the expenses involved. I know you folks were behind because of our brother and sister at liquor. So I'll stop there and answer any questions you folks might have.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On your revenues chart on the last page, Mr. McIntyre, I have to say, 12 years ago, you sat in front of me in a different Ways and Means Committee, talked about Keno being hopefully worth $13 million a year. I'd say you blew that out of the water. I did want to ask on the earlier page, your favorite graph here, you're showing an increase in operating expenses of 3.5 million. And not that you folks don't earn it, you've done great. I just want to understand why that would happen in 1 year.
So first, thank you for the question, Senator. This is the budgeted number. I would take pride in my colleague who spends money like it's his. Take pride in the fact that we've never actually spent our budget, not once, not ever. And so in many cases, we ask for funds that we don't need and don't spend. And because of the formula in the Constitution, our expenses come directly from our revenues. And so if we don't spend it, it drops to the bottom line as profit. And we're in the process of trying to migrate. One of the reasons we've grown the business so much is our migration to digital. We have an iLottery platform and a sports betting platform that really rely heavily on the internet mobile applications. And so we're migrating a large portion, and it's in the budget, towards a CRM program and a Salesforce program, trying to interact with players in a more traditional digital way. I shouldn't say traditional digital, that seems, oxymoronic. But migrating our player base to a digital experience versus a traditional one, while still maintaining the traditional one. Our store revenues and our store commissions have been a record year this year, a record year last year. But we're trying to embrace technology, essentially, and there's a number of expenses in that. Salesforce being the largest expense. It's a expensive platform to run, expensive platform to maintain.
So I have one request. Can I get a pie chart and a graph or a pie chart that has the breakdown of sales by product?
Of course.
So scratches versus Keno
Sure.
versus, traditional lottery, Powerball, Mega Bucks, sports betting,
Sure.
charitable gaming, whatever those metrics. So I can just see what that graph looks
Of
like.
course. So one of pardon? Yeah, that's in our annual report, that graph. But one of the things I would caution is on the last page, when you look at the revenues, the final 1, 2, 3, 4 categories are net of essentially expenses. So like, for example, scratch tickets, that's gross sales, whereas sports betting, that's net of the prizes. And so when you go to, the number would look almost like Bugs Bunny if you go to sports betting, where last year we did $860 million in handle. That's not in the revenue side, obviously. It would dwarf it. And so those products are net of prizes or net of win.
I guess I'm looking at, I want to see what the sales looks like. I want to see what the profit looks like.
Of course,
See
yeah.
those
Yeah.
two graphs side by side,
Sure.
how they relate to each other.
Sure, our margins are, our blended margin is around 27%, 28%, depending on the product. Obviously, in a big Powerball year, it'll be much higher because it's a 40% product. Whereas sports is very low for where it's the handle, but it's very profitable because of the way it's set up. So,
Great.
but absolutely, Senator, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions from? Great job as always, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you. Back on schedule.
Back on schedule, where are we at here? Back on schedule. Next up is security regulation.
Good morning.
Hi, guys. Sure. Introduce yourself, guys.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. My name is Barry Glennon. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Securities Regulation. I'm here with Eric Forcier, a Deputy Secretary with Secretary of State's Office and Bureau of Securities. First off, I just appreciate the opportunity to be here today to present revenue information to you. I wish I could report the same numbers as lottery. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It's perhaps maybe a third, but it's still significant. Just as a real quick review, perhaps for newer members, the Bureau of Securities is organized under the Secretary of State's Office. Our primary role is the regulation and regulatory oversight of broker-dealers and investment advisors and their agents, for which there are many. Just to give you a flavor, on the broker-dealer side, there are well over 148,000 registered representatives that we register each year, and 5,200 investment advisors. So that's our revenue is really comes from two sources: the licensing fees for those who conduct securities business in the state, and then the securities products that are filed. So essentially two buckets. And what I've provided to the committee here today is just a brief historical of 5 years of where our revenue position has been for these two categories. And as you can see, between broker-dealers and investment and securities registrations, revenue has been a little over $213 million. With respect to 2023 revenue, actually I should start with 2022. We concluded 2022 with $44.1 million, which was on target. And we anticipate that we will finish 2023 based on current filings that we've experienced thus far, that we should arrive at $45 million, which is also our target. our revenue comes in really in tranches, primarily in January of each year as well. In January, it's primarily the securities, the agent registrations, and then in May, April, May, our investment company securities product fees, primarily mutual funds. It's a huge source of revenue for the Bureau. So we anticipate to conclude this fiscal year at 45 million and increasing approximately 800,000 in 2024, and then up to 46.6 projected in 2025. So we're on target.
Great. I just have a quick question. I'm noticing when you, on the sheet you provided on the middle line there, the security registrations are at 4 million, but you expect to get up to 23 million. Assuming that's cyclical and is due in April, and we're going to
Yes.
see a huge rise in that revenue number in
It's
April.
enormous. We have, the state of New Hampshire registers over 15,000 mutual funds each year and the registration fees are 1,000 per mutual fund, per class and, fund and class. So it is a significant source, and we see a lot of activity right around that time. So that's why I'm confident that we will see, the full 45 million by year end.
Thank you. Questions? Senator Oswald.
Thank you. I noticed that securities registration has been declining, but you're expecting it to start moving back up slowly.
Yes.
Could you just tell us about
It's-
why the decline and why you think
It-
it's going to go
it's-
back up?
Certainly, I'm sorry to jump the question here. It is cyclical. We do see that primarily with investment companies, mutual fund filers, that there's a certain expansion and contraction that takes place. Firms will decide not to offer their products for whatever reason, or maybe cost cutting on the part of the investment company not to register in New Hampshire. And then other times we see large family of funds coming into the state, newer funds that register, at $1,000 per fund. So it does have its ebbs and tides, but it's still consistently in the lower 20 million range each year.
Thank you. You don't have anything here in terms of fines that we have recovered or cases that we have won?
Thank you for asking that, Senator D'Alessandro. We are a self-funded agency, so all Bureau expenses are paid through fines and penalties that we receive during the year. So they're not reflected in these numbers as general fund. However, our fines do vary based upon the cases that are being brought during the year. They can range, and we've seen from $1.5 million to 7 million, 8 million. Largely depends on the cases. It's hard to actually project what they will be, but certainly the baseline is to cover our expenses. And I think to anticipate your question, Senator, that what happens at the end of the fiscal year is that after Bureau expenses are paid, then those funds lapse to the general fund.
Okay.
And I can speak to that a bit. We are expecting to well exceed our budget this year with enforcement fines. We do expect to pour some over into the general fund. It's hard to say the exact dollar amount, given the status of the pending cases that we have right now, and whether they close out between now and the end of the fiscal year is really hard to predict. But I can assure you that we're going to meet our budget with fines and penalties and have some amount pour over. That exact amount is yet to be determined in the next 60 to 90 days.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, those will just be one-time funds. We don't know that's going to happen to the next year, so not predictable.
That is correct, Senator. However, we've been pretty confident in being able to cover our expenses. And I would say on average, no less than $1 million elapses to the general fund each year.
Great, thank you. Anything else? Guys are off the hook.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now we're here. Safety is up next. Gentlemen, introduce yourself and welcome back.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Steve Lavoy, I'm the Assistant Commissioner at the Department of Safety. And with me is Scott Breyer, who is the Bureau Chief of the Road Toll Bureau. And so we're reporting today on highway fund revenues and general fund revenues collected at the department. The department is really the primary highway fund revenue collection agency for the state of New Hampshire. Those funds, as you're well aware, support the Department of Transportation, but also support the functions at the Department of Safety as well. Page 3 of the presentation gives you a high-level overview of the summary. We collect approximately $258 million in unrestricted gross highway funds, split between the Road Toll Bureau and then also at our Division of Motor Vehicles locations across the state. Our general fund sources are spread out throughout the department. It's really a small amount in the grand scheme of things, about $9 million in total, but we do provide that information for you. Oh, I apologize. Yep. Is that better? Good. So about $9 million in general funds that we collect across the department. Not large in the overall scheme of the general fund, but the information is provided for you as well. So we'll start with the highway fund revenue projections on page 5. In FY22, we collected $258.3 million in highway fund revenue, which was about 3% higher than our plan. And in FY23, we're projecting to collect $257.8 million in highway fund revenues, and that's 2% over the plan. What you'll see from this chart here is that even though we're exceeding our plans for 22 and 23, the highway fund as a whole revenue has not been increasing over time. And so we've maintained an annual average of 1.2% increase, and that's not keeping up with the pace of expenditures on the other side of the equation. The House approved in the 24-25 budget a $10 million transfer of general funds into the highway fund to help partially address the structural deficit into the next biennium. And these similar transfers have occurred in prior bienniums as well. I'm going to turn it over to Scott Breyer to go over the road toll operations, which is one major component of our highway fund collections.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The Road Toll Bureau is statutorily responsible for collecting motor fuels, most commonly referred to as the gas tax, and enforcing compliance through the motor vehicle road toll law through its field audit bureau. Road toll law is not related to toll booths on the turnpike system, which is operated by the Department of Transportation. I just kind of want to give you an overview of what we do at Road Toll. We have approximately 180 motor fuel distributor licenses. We have between 70 to 80 motor fuel transporter license. As far as the International Fuel Tax Agreement licenses, we vary between 1,700 and 1,800, and we have approximately 250 oil discharge and pollution control licensees. On the next page, this is just a schematic trying to show you how the road toll tax is collected. Basically, we're a distributor tax. Basically, product comes in, barge into the tank farms. At the tank farms is if you were going to say Newington or Portsmouth, there's terminals where they pick up on the terminals. The trucks pick up at the terminal. And the difference between our taxes don't kick in until the truck delivers it to the retail station, or it's sold to the first unlicensed user. We have various schedules and tracking systems. So basically, the most important thing is being able to track the product flow of the gasoline and diesel fuel. We also collect alternative fuel tax too, which is compressed natural gas, propane, some of the alternative fuels. Just a couple of factors that may affect road toll. As you know, price reached a high of almost $5 a gallon back last June. Gas prices have declined and stabilized. According to AAA, the average price a gallon in New Hampshire as of the middle of as of this time period, middle of April, is about $3.67. This is up about 40, just up about 40 cents, 41 cents from last year's average of $3.29. I'm sorry, $3.27. Then just just trying to provide some additional information here about the U.S. Energy Administration forecasts that prices will peak between 350 and 360 in June, and the average will probably be 350 through the summer. Also, the EIA expects crude oil prices to average about $85 a barrel and fall to 81 in 24. Weather has an impact on fuel taxes. Dry summers, sunny, and then snowy winters where there's a lot of skiing and snowmobiling helps to drive tourism, which results in increased fuel consumption. So when we have like a lack of snow or warm temperatures, typically that causes a downward pressure on fuel tax collection in the winter. And just some economic stats, the U.S. Department of Commerce, it's a real gross domestic product increased to a rate of 2.6 in the fourth quarter of 2022. And in the third quarter of 22, the gross domestic product increased to a rate of 3.2. And then as of April, the consumer price index for all items rose about 5% over the 12 months ending March 2023. This has been the smallest increase since period ending in May of 21. And I turn it back to, as far as unrestricted revenue, in fiscal year 22, we collected about 124 million in revenues, which 2.5 or 2% more than planned, which was what the plan was 121.5. Fiscal year 23, we're projecting to collect 124.3 million in revenues, which we're thinking is about 2.5 million or 2% more than planned. That for this year would be 121.8 million. In fiscal year 24 and 25 projections, we're assuming a 0.5% increase in both fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 due to downward pressure on consumption. As the cars become more fuel efficient and you're starting to see a transition from gasoline, it's still not significant, but you're seeing more and more people buying the electric vehicles. So what we're thinking is that's gonna cause a downward pressure on the road toll collection.
Can I just ask a question on it again before we jump in, go further? So for 23, 22, we predicted 21.5, we ended up with 24 million as actuals. In 23, what was the predicted, what was the plan?
We, based on where we are right now, we're thinking that by June 30th, we're gonna collect 124.3 million. Which is about 2% higher. The plan for this year is 121.8. We have noticed, did notice February and March that the revenues took a little dip from the previous year, but during most of the year this year, they were a little above. So, but we think that we're gonna come in at about 100
And one last question. So on the bottom of the page, on the right-hand side of that unrestricted revenue toll page, it says the per gallon fee is 22.2 cents per gallon.
Yes, sir.
And how many years has that been consistent?
Oh, that's been there, I get you exact date, but before that it was 18. I think that was 2014, 20, I can get the
So
exact
basically,
date.
I'm just trying to say, all the numbers on this page are relative to that same exact dollar.
Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
I'm gonna turn it.
I'm trying to remember back to 2014 when we raised it to 22 cents. Did it have a sunset date?
Yes.
When?
I think it was based on the number of years when the bonds were gonna be paid off. Yeah.
So when does it sunset and go back to 18 cents?
I'll get that for you. I don't even want to guess, but I think it's,
Yeah, no,
we'll get it.
we can get you that info. So DOT manages the TIFIA loans, and so we
Hopefully it
can
won't be in the next.
obtain that for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on road toll before we move on to the DMV revenues? So on page 10, there's some factors impacting DMV fee estimates. Unlike the road toll, DMV fees aren't impacted by as much by economy and weather and those factors. We're a rural state. We don't have a lot of public transportation options, so vehicle usage is high and oftentimes required to obtain goods and services when you're living in New Hampshire. Vehicle sales have been impacted due to lack of inventory as a result of supply chain shortages, and we're seeing that industry kind of change to some more custom-built orders as well. But inventory levels are starting to get replenished, and pent-up demand is being combined with inelastic demand, hopefully to offset the downward pressure on prices. So we should see some positive impact on registrations, title, and inspection revenues moving into the future years. Page 11 shows motor vehicle registration revenues. In FY22, we collected $90 million, which is 1.8 million or 2% over plan. In 23, we're projecting to collect $90 million in revenue, which is 1.7 million or 2% over plan. And the registration revenues are projected to increase by about 0.5% in both 24 and 25. Page 12 shows motor vehicle operators revenue. These are your driver licenses. The thing that sticks out here, which you'll see, is there's a dip year every 5 years. That has to do with a change in the law that moved from a 4-year license to a 5-year license. And we expect that dip year to resolve itself by about 2035. In FY22, we collected $15.1 million in license revenue, which was 2.8 million over plan. And in FY23, we're projecting to collect 15.5 million in revenue, which is 2.5 million over plan. The other point to note here is that the real ID driver license requirements have been pushed out and are now effective on May 7th, 2025. Motor vehicle title revenue on page 13, relatively flat. We've collected 9.6 million in FY22, which is about 200,000 less than planned. In 23, we're projecting to collect 9.1 million in revenue, which is about 600,000 less than planned. We are expecting those numbers to recover in the next year in 24 and 25, so we're assuming a 6% increase compared to FY23 amounts. And again, that goes back to new vehicle purchases and inventory and also the type of vehicles that people are buying. Motor vehicle inspection revenue, relatively flat. FY22, we collect $4 million. In FY23, we're expecting to collect 3.9, and we projected those numbers out consistently in 24 and 25. And then lastly, on page 15, we have miscellaneous motor vehicle fees. One of the largest sources here are plea by mail revenues. In 22, we collected 5.9 million, which was 1.7 million less than planned. In 23, we're projecting to collect 5.4 million, which is 2.2 million less than planned. And we're expecting a 2% increase over 23 estimates in 24 and 25. And the court fines as well, another big area where we've collected 5.6 million in 22, and we're expecting that to collect 5.6 million again in FY23, which is slightly over plan. And we're assuming similar collection rates moving into the future. And then lastly, on page 17, as I mentioned, we do collect a small number of general funds across the department. Those figures and projections are here for you. In total, we're projecting to collect $7.6 million in general funds in 23, and we're estimating to collect 8.4 in 24 and 8 million even in 25, respectively. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So I'll ask it. So EVs are my topic right now that I'm talking about, and how that is going to affect our long-term road toll and road toll usage and ideas and for how to fix that, right? We know that these revenues, gas revenues, are obviously going to decline over time as EVs become more and more popular, or as hybrids even become more popular. We're going to see, 50 mile per gallon type of, efficiencies, which obviously are going to be a lot different than when we were looking 10 years ago at 20 miles per gallon efficiencies. So, thoughts, comments on how on the road toll?
So currently, there's a bill that's moving through the process that would assess a registration fee for EVs. I believe the latest version of that had a $100 fee for 100% EV and then a $50 fee for a hybrid vehicle. So that's one step in getting to ensuring that all vehicles on the roads are paying their fair share. There's a lot of talk, and I can turn it over to Scott to give you some more detail. There's a lot of talk at a national level about vehicle miles traveled as really the best way to have a truly equitable charge applied across the board. But there's obviously some privacy concerns related to obtaining that information, and how do you do so, and when does the timing of those payments occur. So there's a lot of talk, a lot of ideas, but nothing really concrete as of yet. And Scott, did you want to add anything?
Sure. So I belong to, I sit on the Board of Trustees for the International Fuel Tax Agreement. That's the plan that allows for taxes, any truck that's over 26,000 pounds allows us to track where the trucks travel, so every state gets their fair share of mileage. Recently, Indiana House passed some legislation to start including electric trucks into the IFTA program. But currently, that's only going to handle over 26,000 pounds, but the legislation's working its way through. But there's basically several programs or organizations around the country. There's a road usage fee that we refer to as a RUF, and MBUF, which is a mileage-based user fee. But basically, and it's still down the road a little ways, but I think eventually we're going to go to a mileage-based fee. And that's just, when that actually happens, I don't know, but I think you're gonna see similar to like IFTA and, the International Registration Plan, you might see it start at the federal level and kind of get forced, but there's no definitive answer to that right now. But I know that, the International Fuel Tax Agreement Association is, sinking a lot of significant resources into, analyzing and figuring out how we would implement the mileage-based user fee for the trucking industry, and possibly we think that we might be able to adapt it to passenger vehicles.
Thanks. I had similar questions about EVs. Your road toll revenues, though, don't assume passage of that bill, do they?
They do not,
This is based on current law.
we're basing our numbers completely on what we collect in the Road Toll Bureau.
To follow up, I'm trying to remember what the fiscal note on that bill looked like. How much revenue would that add? somewhere in
So,
here?
as the bill was amended, I believe it was amended from $50 to $100. And right now we have 6,000 vehicles. The bill doesn't go in effect, so the first year we do it, it won't go in effect till January. So the first year, based on the current electric vehicles and plug-ins, it bring in about 400,000. And then the year after, when the first full year, it'll bring in about 800,000. But one interesting thing I have seen looking at the numbers is, when we first started talking about fuel tax and electric vehicles, the numbers are low, but like last year it was like around just over 4,000, and now the numbers hopped up over 6,000. So the electric vehicle sales are definitely increasing, and will start having an impact on the fuel tax if you just keep the current model.
Thank you.
Commissioner, nice to see you. You debonair. I want to know about the weigh stations. Are they ever open? Are we ever weighing any over the weight vehicles? And we went from 80,000 to 100,000, right? Is 80,000 pounds the limit as we speak?
That I'd have to get back to you. I don't know the specifics about what the weights are. The weigh stations are open.
Occasionally.
The way stations are open on occasion. The challenge becomes if you open the way station on 93 and everyone's aware that it's open, it's easy to take an alternate route. And so what state police has done instead is really enforce with mobile scale and mobile weighing locations. And so you don't always see those because those are spread out across the state.
But when we dispensed with the people that used to weigh the trucks and moved them over to state police, how many people are actually involved in that activity as we speak?
Again, I'd have to get back to you to give you actual numbers, but that's a federal requirement that we work with DOT and oversee the overweight program, as you know, on their behalf. We have to maintain certain number of weighing and inspections, and so those numbers won't be declining. But I can get you the exact number of how many people are working on that.
Thank you.
Senator, I will tell you that the mobile weigh station was open in Canterbury just yesterday. So
Very good.
the state police are doing it on a regular basis. Yeah. Well, that's the highway safety version of state police, isn't it?
That's state police. It's Troop G, so it's the Commercial Motor Vehicle Enforcement Unit.
Any further questions? Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you.
I did. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Nicolopoulos. I'm the Commissioner of Insurance for the New Hampshire Insurance Department. I'm joined today by Christy Rice, our Assistant Commissioner, and Amy Duham, our Chief Tax Officer. Much of our presentation will be given by Amy, and it will be outlined in the slides that she just provided you. We're happy to answer any questions about the organization of the Insurance Department or projects we're working on, but I thought we would dive right into Amy's presentation.
Great, thank you for having us today. We'll go over our slides and we'll start out by looking at the revenue sources, how we collect our income, what our current revenue projections are and where we expect to finish fiscal year 23. And then we're going to look ahead to fiscal year 24 and 25. So taking a look at our revenue sources, I'll tell you that most of that comes from premium tax revenue, or about 80%. The other 20% would be from our fees and penalties that we collect, and those are from licensed and registered entities, along with our insurance producers and adjusters. So as of year-end 2022, there were 1,200 insurance companies and 92 risk retention groups that we collected premium tax returns from. The property and casualty and life lines of business, we collected a tax rate of 1.25%, and for accident and health lines of business, we collected 2%. And New Hampshire does have a minimum annual premium tax return of $200. We also have a retaliatory law in place, and this is a provision that is meant to equalize the tax burden across all states. So we will collect the greater of the New Hampshire tax rate or the company's state of domicile tax rate. So for example, New Mexico has a tax rate of 3% on their property casualty lines, and ours is only 1.25%. So we'll go ahead and collect the 3% from the companies that are domiciled in New Mexico. And then I'd like to explain how we collect our premium tax, where we collect 100% of that in advance. So in March, we collected the 2022 calendar year premium tax liability. But then we subtract out what they paid on their prior year tax return as an estimate, and that gives us a true up for 2022. Then we will collect 100% of their 2022 tax liability as an estimated payment for 23. So if their taxes were to increase, the true-up increases along with their prepayment for the following year. So that's like a double impact to our revenue. Whether it goes up or down, it's a double impact. So if we flip to the next slide and take a look at the bar graph, you're going to see our historical view of our general fund revenue from our plan to our actual results as they are reported by the annual comprehensive financial report. And you'll see here slight upticks over the years. We do take a conservative approach with our projections because of those large fluctuations in our actual results. And you'll also see that 4 out of those past 10 years where the revenue actually decreased from the prior year. So now we're going to dive in and take a look at fiscal year 2023, where we started out with an agency submission of $135 million, which we later revised up to $139 million. We took a look at the actual results as of March 31st, and we project our fiscal year-end close to be at about $154 million as of June 30th. You'll notice that's a variance of $15.3 million. And taking a look as of March 31st, we have $4.9 million of that variance is attributable to tax revenue and $2.4 million in fee revenue. The tax revenue is due to an increase in the premiums written, which is our tax base, and the fee revenue is due to our producers and our adjusters continuing to be licensed in New Hampshire. We do process refunds from April through June, through fiscal year end close. So any revenue that comes in the last 3 months of this fiscal year, a lot of that will be netted against our refund, so there won't be a big impact in further revenue collected this year. As we look ahead to fiscal year 24 and 25, we've projected out $139 and $142 million respectively. And while this fiscal year is greater than we expected due to the market not reacting as anticipated post the pandemic, we do expect a tightening of the insurance market and a moderate decrease in revenue the next 2 fiscal years.
Thank you, Amy. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
The last page just does break out the details of 24 and 25. That's okay.
So I guess I do have a question. And again, it has to do with this year you're projecting such a large increase over plan, and then next year you go backwards. And you're saying you're projecting a reduction, and I'm trying to understand. I'm not sure insurance premiums are going down, and so how does that result in a reduction in revenue?
There are a number of things that factored into our anticipation, our projections for next year. Some of it is that we are seeing some market choices. This year, we saw premium increases almost across the board. And what that resulted in actual premium volume year over year is consumers changing their buying habits. And so what we saw is your insurance company might have had a 10% increase, but you've opted to price and quote and move your insurance to another market or change your coverages. And so despite that increase, we've not seen the growth that we've had. Also, we're looking at, because we collect premium tax in advance, we've now had 2 years in a row where we've beaten the previous year. What the companies have to do is pay ahead that same increase from the previous year forward. And so even a modest reduction, even a $4 million reduction in premium tax for next year will impact almost a $9 million or $8 million reduction in the total premium given, because they're getting a credit of $4 million that they prepaid, plus their prepayment going forward is $4 million. Given that historically 40% of the years we failed to raise more money in the next year, we're projecting, and we've now had 3 years in a row of up, we're projecting that that's going to reset some. Also, because of the pandemic, a couple of things changed in the marketplace. We saw for the first time nearly 210,000 licensees obtain and renew their New Hampshire producer or agent's license. And that was 100% a product of, during COVID, having staffing centers nationwide for these big insurance companies. The insurance companies just said, license everybody. We don't know who's going to be managing New Hampshire, so license all our producers, license all our adjusters. Those licenses are 2-year licenses, and so the cycle is a little slower to respond, but we anticipate a sharp decrease in the number of licensees going forward to 24 and 25 because we just don't need 210,000 licensees for a state of 1.3 million people. I think additionally, some smaller numbers, we're seeing, we had in 22 and 23, the largest fine we ever gave to companies. They were a little more than $250,000, and which is very atypical. I wouldn't anticipate having fines like that. And our tax team has been reconstituted over the last 2 years, and we've raised a lot of money doing audits of insurance companies, making sure that they're complying with each and every one of our line item retaliatory taxes. And you only get that revenue once. And so when my team looks at all of those lines, we're projecting 139 and 142. And, you know, we'll be candid, we're always a little bit conservative, but not much.
We have one more follow-up, and then I'll go to you, Senator. So I guess my other question is Medicaid expansion and the change in Medicaid expansion, the removal of the federal declaration of emergency and shifting. What does that do to your revenues? What does that do to your agency?
That's a great question, Senator. There's a couple of things that are going to happen. I think Medicaid expansion, provided Medicaid is expanded, will be a wash on our numbers. What we're going to see is a shift in the Medicaid redeterminations. There are some 100,000 people today that are on Medicaid that need to be redetermined. No one knows the number. You know, I've heard 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 that may be redetermined off. For those folks that are redetermined off, that's going to happen over 12 months starting in June of this year. So 8% of those people will be redetermined each month, June to June. And those people will then have a 12-month window and a special enrollment period to enroll in the individual marketplace if they so choose. And so we are going to see people, 8% a month of the people who will be redetermined, I don't know that number, falling off those rolls. That will have a direct impact on the 2% premium tax that we collect from the MCOs. Fortunately for the state budget, that money is segregated and paid over to DHHS to help fund Medicaid expansion, so it will not have an impact on our general fund revenue that we'll be paying off to you. Over the next 24 months from June forward, we are going to see those numbers go down as they're redetermined off, and then over a 12-month period as they opt or may opt to join the individual marketplace, them coming back on. That'll be a very slow transition as people need the coverage.
Senator Oswald.
Thank you. You weren't speaking into the microphone, so I couldn't hear
So sorry.
anything you said. But I share Senator Lane's question. Premiums are not going down. Healthcare costs are going up. There's pent-up demand. So could you try and explain it again into the microphone about why you think the premium tax is going to go down?
Our premium numbers, our projection numbers for 24 and 25 are actually increases over our premium projection numbers for 22 and 23. They are decreases from our actuals. We collected more in the last 2 years than we thought. In part, that is because I think the market was slow to respond to the COVID emergency. We have seen consumers making consumer choices related to their policies. So as their premium rate goes up, when they get their renewal quote for their house or their car, and there's an increase, and on average those increases in the P&C world, in the car and house world, is about 10%. What consumers are doing, they're choosing to quote their business outside of their current providers, and what's actually happening in the marketplace is they're getting competitive quotes, so we're not seeing those increases roll directly through. Also, because premium tax is collected in advance, and so when we just collected premium tax in March of this year, we collected it as a prepayment on what they actually owe us in March of next year. And when there is when the premium tax number declines some, there is a double impact. They get a refund for what they overpaid last year, and their projected payment for the next year is also reduced. And so any reduction year over year will be felt double. And so 40% of the years, in our experience, we fail to meet the premium tax collection number that we collected in the previous year. So just under half the time, we experience a decrease, and that is driven almost entirely because of the method that we collect prepayment. Health insurance premiums they are going up, but much like in our P&C world, companies are choosing to modify the benefit structure some. We've had a 1332 waiver program here in New Hampshire. It's a federal grant program that's helped us with our individual market rates. And so, overall premiums are going up. We're estimating that the total revenue collection will be flat with our projections from last year at 139 and 142 million.
So when we lowered the property and casualty rate, the reason we did it was that these companies were supposed to repatriate to New Hampshire and create something like 750 new jobs. Do we know that that actually happened to justify that rate decrease that the legislature made back in the day?
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't the commissioner back when that happened. I know we have a lot of great companies here in New Hampshire. It's not a surprise that Hanover Insurance and Liberty Mutual have such a base here in New Hampshire. And I think, though I don't have the numbers, maybe the insurance companies do, I think New Hampshire is batting outside of its size for the number of domestic companies we have, 60 something. And it's a place where companies want to do business. We have an environment here where our insurance companies, it's a fact of New Hampshire is we write in the state of New Hampshire 0.4%, so less than 0.5% of the nationwide's insurance. And so I often wonder why these insurance companies based all over the nation develop such a competitive marketplace here with such a small market. And I think it's because we've created an environment of prudent people who have good employees and care for their homes and respect their property, and a regulatory environment that allows them to do business here. They're certainly not breaking into a very big market, but we've got competitive markets in all of our insurance marketplaces except for medical malpractice insurance. That's not something that can be said across the nation. We're very lucky here.
Have you seen the report that the Hospital Association issued yesterday about Anthem being so behind on paying their claims? And is the insurance department going to look into that?
Yes, I've seen the report. I've seen other iterations of this report that have been issued from, I think the first one I saw was summer 21. And we've looked at it. It's unfortunate. It was unfortunate that I saw that report after it was released to the public yesterday. My team, so any healthcare provider in the state who's having an issue with any of our payers, we have a consumer services team that can help manage those contractual relationships. And if there is a payer, any of our state regulated payers that's slow, I encourage the providers to come to us and we will help coordinate that. I've been on dozens and dozens of calls with the Hospital Association, and the numbers in that report are jarring, if I'm completely honest with you. They're also misleading. It's just so you can understand the scope. That report claimed that there was some $300 million in outstanding AR.
Right, that's charges. I get it.
But But that charge is about 50%. So 300 million is 150 million. In that report, some 42% of those charges were not overdue. They were 30 days or less. And so that's about another 60 million. So we're now down to 90 million of outstanding AR. That report didn't allege the $90 million in AR was in fact clean claims. Those are claims that are subject to timely payment. That $90 million of questionable or unpaid AR will include some clean claims, I'm sure, will include some denied claims, will include some claims where providers have said you need to provide us supporting documentation. You failed to get prior auth, you double billed us, you overbilled us, all of those things. And I think it's also important to understand the scope of Anthem in New Hampshire. Anthem in New Hampshire pays nearly $2 billion a year in medical claims, which is 165 or 175 million per month in medical claims. And so I think when you look at all of that, it's not as jarring as the report. That being said, our team is willing to work with any hospital or any provider who's having issues. And we both have an ability to do one-offs, which is working with our consumers. And then if there is a systemic problem, we then elevate that to one of two things, either an investigation where we look at the company's practices to make sure, or we can do a market conduct exam, which both of those processes are confidential, but we can do. So we're happy to participate in any discussions related to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you think of something else, just let us know and we can get you the information.
All right, good morning. Well, Rich Lavers, Deputy Commissioner with the New Hampshire Department of Employment Security.
Brian Gottlob, Director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau of the Department of Employment Security.
So we handed out some material we'll be going over. Brian and I will be alternating back and forth on talking about various points, and obviously at any point that there are questions, just flag us down, stop us, and we'll address those as we go. And Brian will get us started.
Great. Thank you, Rich. So on the first page, we have what we consider are the key themes in the economy, both the national and the New Hampshire economy. One, importantly, confidence is very low right now. You hear a lot of negative news in the media, a lot of economists talking about negative things. The probability of recession is significant, but in 2022, but we believe it's declined and has been primarily pushed off until perhaps 2024, but we're still optimistic. Our baseline forecast is not for a recession. Good news, inflation is moderating. Even food prices came down last month, which is has a big impact on how people assess the economy and their personal circumstances. Most importantly, in our outlook, the labor market is really strong. It's strong nationally, but it's strong especially here in New Hampshire, and it really should be cause for lower levels of pessimism among households in particular. But recognizing things are changing a bit, we do expect job growth to slow throughout the remainder of the year. Consumer spending, we think, is going to hold up. It's declining. You saw retail sales last month showed some negative, but we think there's reasons for that, and it will stabilize. Banks, a lot of news lately about the situations in the banking industry, but we believe the banking industry overall is well capitalized, and particularly in New Hampshire, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But still, credit availability is being reduced. Banks are becoming more cautious for a number of reasons, economic conditions that they're concerned about, but also situations in the banking industry that have made it a little bit more difficult for them to lend. But we are more optimistic overall than we were just a few months ago when we spoke to both the House and the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Still, we want to be realistic. This is not a Pollyannish outlook. There are a lot of risks out there that could go wrong. So the page 3 just shows 2 measures of confidence that we look at. National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is the red or orange line, shows that among small businesses, confidence has been declining. We track that fairly closely because in the past it has had a pretty good relationship with how private sector job growth in New Hampshire is going. We have a lot of small businesses in there in New Hampshire, so their sentiment is important, even though this is a national number. The blue line is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, an alternative to the Consumer Confidence Index. It does a better job of looking at how people feel about their individual households as opposed to the overall economy. But it is clear that there's a lot of pessimism out there. We don't have a New Hampshire confidence index. So one of the things that we did during the pandemic is look at a surrogate measure. And that's the relative searches on Google on the word recession. And that tends to track pretty well when economic conditions are turning down or about to turn down. People become more concerned. They start searching on terms related to recession. And as you can see in page 4, prior to the pandemic, that shaded area to the left, there was substantial increase in searches on the word recession. The next time it jumped dramatically was as the energy markets were in turmoil after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Prices shot up. People became very concerned about the economy, and as a consequence, a lot of searches on the term recession. It has eased off some, but it has bounced around a little bit. There's clear that there's some anxiety in the national economy and the New Hampshire economy.
And as you can see, we try to be creative in finding those leading indicators, particularly those that track well with the New Hampshire economy, and looking at things like that with Google search terms to see what was really going on in people's brains. It tracks well. It's a good leading indicator. You'll see some others where Brian is quite creative in things that he looks at to try to stay ahead of some of those turning points in the economy. When we go to the next slide and looking at private sector payroll, this is on slide page 5. I'm sorry. You can see New Hampshire continues to be an outlier in New England in terms of private sector payroll growth compared to pre-pandemic peak. Numbers came out this week for March. We added another 1,500 private sector payroll jobs over the month. We're up nearly 16,000 private sector payroll jobs compared to the pre-pandemic peak. And so you can see how New Hampshire compares to our other New England states. And they're far to the wrong way on this chart, away from New Hampshire. So we continue to see that strong growth, but we are expecting that growth to slow down. Something to note there, and as we talked with both the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees earlier in the year, that growth and the bounce coming out of the pandemic in payroll jobs has not been equally experienced. You certainly hear from employers in your districts, particularly healthcare employers, that continue to struggle. And within that struggle, we're looking at nursing positions. That continues to be a universal problem amongst different healthcare employers, whether it be your hospitals, your long-term care providers, both residential and community-based, so that those nursing positions continue to be problematic for those employers to fill. And also the state as an employer. The state employment is down significantly compared to pre-pandemic peak. So just pointing those out to show that not all of it has been experienced equally. So the concerns being raised by healthcare sector in particular are very real. When we turn to the next slide and just looking at that payroll growth over the last 12 months, you can see New Hampshire even stronger compared to some of the other New England states, and where we stand nationally with about 3% growth over that time period. Now, going on to the next slide. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just ask a question on that slide? So that 3% growth is an increase in payroll, but not necessarily increase in employees? Is that
So that's an increase in payroll as reported by employers.
Thank you.
Yep. And there'll be you'll see a distinction in that when we get a little bit later on in the presentation, when you look at the household survey that measures labor force and individuals indicating, employed, unemployed, and you'll see a little bit of a disparity between those two measures right now. Going on to the next slide, you'll see that private sector payroll growth is slowing, and is expected to slow. Although, as Brian had indicated, the expectation for what we're looking at for the remainder of 2023 is much stronger than what we had originally been looking at when we talked to the committees earlier in the year.
Looking at slide number 8, this is a measure of the job openings rate in the state, and we compare New Hampshire to the U.S. average overall. And the job openings rate is simply based on a survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, and they survey employers and ask them how many job openings they have. And the openings rate is that number divided by the overall employment in the state. So what we see is that the job openings rate in New Hampshire and the U.S. jumped after the pandemic. We know a lot of people quit their jobs. They left their jobs for a different job. And when that happens, it creates an opening. So a whole lot of labor market churn in the economy after the pandemic. And that hasn't really settled down much. There's still a lot of job openings in New Hampshire. There's a lot of job openings nationally. But on the next slide.
One more quick question. Sure. Sorry, over here, Chair. Yeah. So that 6.9, what does that represent?
That represents
jobs.
That represents, it would be, so we have almost 700,000, well, as of the last month, we actually have 700,000 people employed, payroll employment in New Hampshire. So 6% of that is going to be a pretty large number. 60, well, not even 60,000 or so, 70, between 60. Now, that doesn't mean that that's, new hiring. That's partly a function of people leaving one job for another. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's 60,000 jobs that could be added to the New Hampshire economy. It just means that because of a combination of new employment growth and people moving from one job to another, that adds up to that amount.
There's roughly 60,000
Yeah.
vacancies.
Yeah.
Give or take on a rolling
At any one,
basis.
yeah. And then typically, I will tell you that typically at any one time, there's probably around a good 20,000. In a typical, if we weren't, the prior to the pandemic. There's always a lot of openings. The only time there's not a lot of openings is when we're in a recession or when employers are cutting. People, when the economy is weak, people don't change jobs as much. We have a high quit rate right now. One of the reasons why we have a high quit rate is there's a lot of job openings out there. So people are moving to get better pay. They moved after the pandemic to get better pay. A lot of employers realized that they had to raise their wages, particularly among lower skilled occupations, hospitality, retail. Those wages went up double digits after the pandemic over a 1 year period. So there's a lot of movement, and that creates a lot of openings. But the best metric that is on page 9, on slide 9, that's a little different. That combines two metrics. One, the job openings rate that I mentioned, but also the job hirings rate, which is the same survey. Companies are asked how many people they were able to hire. Okay, so the difference between the openings and the hiring rate is what I call the unfilled job openings rate. So a little less than half of the jobs that are open are unfilled at the moment, and that's higher than the U.S. overall, and it has been pretty consistently post-pandemic. We've had more openings, one. We've also had good hiring rate, but we have such strong job growth. Our labor force hasn't grown, and Rich will talk a little as much as we would like, or hasn't recovered as much as we would like. And as a result, we have a very substantial percentage of unfilled job openings in the state. Yes,
So I have a question too, so.
How do you account for the number of people who aren't seeking jobs?
Yes.
And that number seems to be very large.
Yeah, it is extremely large. It is a great mystery. It's one that I tell you, we probably talk about that more during the week than we do any other issue in the economy. It is a mystery. It has recovered a bit more nationally than it has in New Hampshire. And there are we have a whole presentation on this, the demographics of who's out of the labor force.
I'd like to see that, because what I'm witnessing in our community, and I meet with the schools, the mobility factor that's come into play. People aren't hanging around. They stop. Let me talk about those with children, grammar school kids. They're gone. They're in one school for a few months and then they're gone. Where do they go? We talk about a housing crisis. We're talking about this, and so forth. Where do these people go? Where do they evaporate to?
Yeah, well, based on population, we're not losing population. We're adding population, but we are. What is happening is just for a number of reasons, I will tell you, it's a very complicated issue, Senator. Some of it depends on the demographics. Younger people have been out of the labor force to a higher percentage than just about anybody, even older workers who came back. They stepped out during the pandemic. Many of them have come back, so they're not out as much. Younger workers, and we believe it has to do with a number of factors. One, there are other ways that they are earning money that don't show up, that make them somewhat less reluctant to say that they're working or they're in the labor force. There are gig workers, there are influencers, there are a whole host of things that people make money at, younger people in particular, without getting a W-2. They may be reluctant to say that they're employed because they get a call from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics asking them if they're employed. Are they working? If they say yes, well, one, they may not think of themselves if they're sitting at their computer playing video games, which they can do and make money, I learned, surprisingly. Somebody calls them and says, are you working? Are you employed? Are you in the labor force? Are you looking for work? They may say no. Our view is we should, the Bureau, and we've said this to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they should change their survey when they call people. The first question they ought to ask is somebody paying you to do something?
And I guarantee that some of those younger people who don't show up as in the labor force would show up in the labor force. So it's a very complicated issue.
Yeah.
So just going back to this chart that you're looking at the 2.7%, again, using that same metric,
Yeah.
we talked about 700,000 jobs as
Yeah.
a job metric. It's about
Yeah,
17,500
20,
jobs roughly.
somewhere
that
around
are
there.
In a gap period
Yep.
that we don't have workers for.
Yep, and that is basically what we've been pretty much averaging when we look at a different data set. We actually look at online job postings. We have a source for that, and it's been between 15 to 20,000 for the entire post-pandemic period. So they're different measures. One, it's actually scouring all of the job boards online, registering with us, all of those, but it's a very consistent number.
And I will say you're spot on about the younger crowd. I found out my son sells sneakers. Right? And he had asked me about a server he had built, and I didn't even know he was doing it, but he's making good money, buying and selling sneakers. So there are people like that are not necessarily showing up, that are, my son's 19 years old and he's not going to show up in any kind of survey that's showing how is he making his money. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got 60 employees. I had 60 employees before the recession. I have the pandemic. I have 60 employees now, but I need 20 more. And the reason why is that the employee pre-pandemic is not the same employee post-pandemic. To speak to Senator D'Alessandro's question, and I don't want to turn this into a discussion necessarily, but here's my 2 cents. My 2 cents is that they learned how to live on less money. They learned the value of living at home with mom and dad, and my employees tend to be younger. They learned the value of friendships and social time. And they learn they can find another job very easily.
Yeah.
And one of the weaknesses in this data, this is a lot of data, and it's very well done, but one of the weaknesses in the data is that an employee that used to work 30 hours a week now wants to work 15. The employee that used to work 40 hours a week now wants to work 30. And the person who used to love overtime doesn't want to get anywhere near it. So maybe instead of tracking jobs and people employed, if there were a way to track hours worked, that's really the key metric, right? I need more employees. I think we all need more employees. Every business owner in America needs more employees. But how can you track hours versus jobs?
It is tracked, not as well from my perspective, because it doesn't track workers in all industries at the state level. It will track manufacturing hours worked. It's nationally, it's a better number, and you're right, it has declined somewhat overall. No doubt about it. People have and attitudes toward work certainly have changed, probably particularly among younger people. And I would add one element to why they're not working. They got a lot of stimulus money. When you're in your early 20s, you don't have a mortgage, you do not have a family to support, and you get $4,000 from the federal government. And good chance you got some substantial unemployment benefits because the federal government gave you $600, plus we provided a small additional amount to that. If I were 20 to 25 years old, I'd be on vacation for a long time. I don't think I'm unique in that.
Cell phone bill, beer money, McDonald's. I mean, but your needs are met.
But Senator, we thought our narrative all along was that those people could not do that forever. They could not stay out of the labor force for 40 years, but sure enough, they found different ways to make money, and they're not showing up for other reasons. They may work for a couple of months and then take months off. So if enough people do that on a rolling basis, the number that at any 1 month indicate they're in the labor force is going to be pretty far down.
And the conversation we were having, you go back a year ago when we were looking at the problem in terms of age cohorts that weren't coming back into the labor force and trying to understand it a little bit better because of points being made like yours, Senator Murphy. It was a bookend problem with the labor force at the time. It was your 55-plus-year-old workers, mostly 60-plus. Their participation rate
significantly down compared to participation prior to the pandemic. We were able to explain that a little bit better, made more sense. Some of the concerns raised during the pandemic and being close enough to retirement age. Inflation wasn't as much of a problem at the time. Investments, home values, everything was looking good. Those people made the decision likely to step out a little bit earlier than they had planned prior to the pandemic. And at the same time, we were looking at that 25 to 34-year-old problem and wondering where they were, and we were thinking stimulus money keeping them out. You fast forward to where we are now, those 60-plus-year-old individuals that had left the labor force, they're back. Their participation rate is right back where it was prior to the pandemic, and in some instances exceeding it. 25 to 34-year-olds still significantly down, but as Brian had indicated, the theorizing that we had been doing, because there's not very good data to really track those behaviors well, was that it was stimulus money and the unemployment benefits that they were able to kind of cobble together enough to stay out of the labor force longer, and that they eventually would be coming back. And we're not seeing that yet. And that's why the conversation now turns to other types of things that they are doing for compensation and not necessarily in traditional covered W-2 employment.
Thank you. So the 25 to 34-year-olds that you've described as they were getting unemployment insurance and maybe they scaled back on their expenses and they're not coming back, to what extent is there a gender gap that can be explained by the lack of accessible and affordable childcare that is keeping, I think, women more disproportionately out of returning to the workforce than men?
Well, I'll start trying to answer that, and Brian will have some thoughts there too. But the pandemic, in terms of the individuals that were filing for unemployment, was a majority female. And that was because of the sectors that were heavily impacted. Those service sectors and healthcare employ more women than they do men. So they were at a 60% rate. Those were the women were filing for unemployment versus men. Complete opposite back during the Great Recession, right? Because of the sectors that were impacted, then you were looking at a 60% male rate of filing for unemployment. That 25 to 34-year-old group, you continue to see in the BLS statistics that is a reason cited as to why you're not more fully participating in the labor force is difficulty around childcare. That continues to be a cited reason, and women make up a slightly higher rate in that age group that are not yet back fully participating in the labor force. One point I would add to that as well, and I'm not sure how that impacts one's needs for childcare and also the availability of childcare, is some interesting information that Brian had pointed out earlier this week, was looking at establishment survey, so employer survey in terms of employers that are still providing some level of remote work option for their employees. New Hampshire has the second highest percentage of private sector employers in the country that are indicating that they are continuing to provide some level of remote work option for workers. So Colorado had the most, New Hampshire was right behind them. That will should have an impact on things like childcare, both the need and the availability for those types of intermittent schedules. If you're in and out of the office, and I'm not sure how well the existing makeup within our childcare community would be able to handle those types of fluctuating schedules where you're not fitting into just the bucket of only needing it part-time or only needing it full-time. Now your schedule is changing week to week. That can be difficult, but it also could be very beneficial as well with those additional remote work options for either parent to be home right, with a younger child and perhaps still able to get work done, depending on the age of the child. But I know Brian will have something to add with the gender makeup.
Yeah, I do think we have looked at not only the demographics by age, but also a further breakdown by age and by gender. And you're correct, that there's gender differences at different age levels. And the age group that is most likely to have young children before they are in school full time, that is an issue that women have stepped out of the labor force in greater numbers in that age group. So clearly childcare has some impact. We have tracked surveys of the number of people who say they are not in the labor force because of the need to take care of a child who's not in school or not in daycare over the last couple of years. We've tracked that. And it varies. It varies whether it's during the summer when kids are home and it's more problematic, or when they are likely to be in school or some type of school activity. And I'll tell you, the number, if I were average, it would be about 15,000. Now, we do not think that that's 15,000 people who necessarily would be in the labor force if childcare were available, because some people simply choose to step out, whether childcare, but our estimate is it's probably somewhere in the order of 9,000 to 10,000 people out of the labor force because of childcare issues. And that's a smaller number who say they're inconvenienced by the issue, which is a whole nother survey. So it is problematic for the labor force.
Yeah, I would just say that it's hard to get work done at home when you've got little kids there. So remote work is maybe an illusion.
I would agree in having, I was home with my now 14-year-old from month 3 to month 17. I don't see how I would have gotten any work done during that time. But I also know people are pretty resourceful and are trying to balance that, which is extremely difficult. Changing gears a little bit, we're on slide 10. This is showing the number of registered employers. So just hold it up so folks can see which one we're on. And looking at the growth in the number of registered employers. So this is employers providing employment that register with Employment Security, pay their quarterly unemployment insurance taxes. We've seen significant growth, both in terms of when you compare to the start of the pandemic, that's about a 20% growth in the number of registered employers. And then when you look more recently, starting at the end of 21, it's about a 16% growth rate. Some of that is because of remote work. So some of that are individuals employed by out-of-state employers, but they're fully remote in New Hampshire. So those employers now need to register and report that employee to New Hampshire per localization rules for purposes of where that payroll is reported and the taxes are paid. But still a lot of growth amongst employers providing regular employment as well. The impacts that translates into are, we're looking at a unemployment insurance trust fund that is much healthier than it was compared to the start of the pandemic when we were considered solvent. So our trust fund's up to $360 million right now compared to $300 million prior to the pandemic. That is in part due to that growth in new employers, with those employers coming in at a higher starting tax rate. But all of that has led to that a healthier balance in the trust fund, which does then translate into significant declines in those insurance tax rates that employers are paying because of that growth in the balance of the trust fund. Employers are back to those employers that date back to prior to the pandemic. Their rates for payroll taxes right now on unemployment insurance are back to where they were prior to the pandemic, and continuing to come down because of the growing balance in that fund. Turning to the next slide,
Guys, just one question on this one, on slide 10. I have a question. So again, but this is only for businesses that have created the unemployment insurance profile. So again, going back to the gig workers or people like that, 'cause I remember I seen an IRS statistic, and right after the pandemic, the number of businesses registered and asking for an EIN went through the roof. But again, not every one of those businesses would necessarily be correlated here. So we have significantly more than 52,000 businesses. These are only the businesses that have registered with unemployment insurance.
that is all correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I heard you say there's 360 million in that fund now, and it was 300 million. Didn't we put $50 million of CARES Act funds in there? So really the growth is 10 million from the employers?
Well, we've actually put 109 million in. When you look at there was the original 50 million that was deposited early on, and then there have been smaller deposits made from unused funds from other programs that waterfall back into the trust fund rather than going CARES Act money, rather than having to be redeposited back with U.S. Treasury. So it's been about $109 million in total. The trust fund, because the requirement from the federal government during the pandemic was that not everyone coming in was qualifying for federal unemployment benefits, right? There were a little less than half of the individuals coming in were qualifying for regular state unemployment benefits that got paid out of the state trust fund. So that trust fund took a big hit, which was why that initial $50 million infusion was so important. So the growth with that $60 million above where we were, those reasons are multiple. It's the $109 million that we received in several rounds of payments and CARES Act money. It's also because of the growth in new employers. But you'll see on this next slide on page 11, it's also because there's not much coming out of the trust fund. So the unemployment levels are, and we'll talk a little bit about this, are at historic lows. So those disbursements, those payments coming out are much lower than where they were prior to the pandemic. So it's that combination of factors that you have with more employers paying in, many newer employers that are at a higher starting tax rate compared to your more experienced employers that are much lower, few dollars going out, plus that $109 million in CARES Act money that's been deposited.
Thanks. And, I'm just trying to follow these numbers. So it's up $60 million, but 100 and let's say 10 million was a transfer of federal funds. So it actually would have been lower if we hadn't done that, or no.
So the 109 million was the transfer from those CARES Act programs. So you have several factors that influence that moving balance of the trust fund, right? So we have balance thresholds that trigger tax rate decreases for employers. So when those get hit, it causes a reduction in revenue coming in. So New Hampshire has hit those in part because of those infusions of CARES Act money that have come in. So the growth because of tax payments from employers has been intentionally slowed. So starting with fourth quarter of last year, employers started getting a reduction to those tax rates. They got a half point off of their rate starting with the fourth quarter and the first quarter because the fund had achieved that first milestone balance threshold of 250 million. Employers are now getting a full 1% reduction because the fund is up over 350 million. So those reductions also carry a significant impact on the amount of revenue coming in, and that's what they're designed to do. And the timing, obviously, of those payments from the surplus CARES Act dollars from those programs can have a significant impact in that, and the timing of when those hit in terms of the more expensive quarters that employers have, particularly the first quarter is an expensive quarter for them. So when you have a rate reduction, it has a big impact.
If I were really to simplify the math, we were watching the trust fund before the infusions dropped dramatically. It was like a plane going down, watching the altimeter spin. And we were trying to forecast week by week, day by day, and when we were going to go below zero. So we got below $50 million. That's when the first infusion came. So that's was our low point. So if you say our low point was say $50 million, and then we added 109, that gets us up to 159. And everything after that is really attributable to all of the growth.
So it sounds like a corporate subsidy to me.
200, we had 200, we may have been below where we were, but we still had 200 million in growth in revenue.
Yeah, we paid out from the trust fund over $300 million in benefits during the pandemic.
And thank you for all the work you did for all of our constituents. I
And
mean, it was heroic.
and however the $109 million is characterized, one thing to remember with that, as the trust fund balance grows and you hit those fund balance reduction thresholds that reduce the tax rates for employers, it's reducing the cost for that employer for hiring new people. And that can have a significant influence. And at the time that the deposits were being made with that surplus CARES Act money, at the time, there was concern with employers' ability to hire coming out of the pandemic. And there was an effort to try to reduce the cost that's associated with bringing on each additional new employee. And private sector payroll has really grown, as we've talked about, during that period. Not all because of this, right? A lot more factors than that, but it is a significant consideration for an employer looking at their tax rate, and they're paying that on each employee. When that tax rate goes down significantly, it does change the math for them in terms of their hiring. And were there any other questions on that? Okay.
Just gotta remind members, we got 10 more pages to get through, and we have about 25 minutes to do it. So, questions, we get a few more pages through instead of every page.
Real quick on slide 11, the unemployment program, as I had indicated, that's one reason for the growth in the trust fund. So we're down about 30% volume compared to where we were pre-pandemic. What that translates into is about 2,500 weekly claims in New Hampshire right now. You can compare that to being at about 3,500 weekly claims the same time period in 2019, when we were at a very low unemployment rate. New Hampshire is an outlier in that regard. Nationally, they're only down about 7%, but regionally, when you look at looking at our neighbors to the east and to the west, with Maine and Vermont, Maine has about 7,400 weekly claims right now. Vermont has about 3,200 weekly claims right now, despite half the population and half the labor force. So New Hampshire's 2,500 claims is really a good testament to the strength of the economy, the demand amongst employers right now. And although you might hear and see of layoffs here and there, those layoffs are not translating into unemployment claims right now.
Okay, quickly, chart 12 just shows what's happened to CPI inflation. We have here that we expect it to be under 4% by the end of 2023. I think it'll actually be closer to 3%, partly because of what the Federal Reserve is doing, but also what is happening in other aspects of the economy, as we'll talk a little bit about bank credit that we think will get tighter, that will help slow the economy. On page 13, you see what's happened to year-over-year change in retail sales. You see it has slowed. Some of it has to do with some particulars of spending patterns. One, people are spending less on goods and more on services, and services aren't in the retail sales and end of consumer spending. Another aspect is that
automobiles and gasoline expenditures have declined, and that's taken a hit to overall retail sales. But another aspect is people this year, for whatever reason, people, when they receive their tax refunds, generally spend that money, or a lot of people spend that money anyway. And tax refunds have been slower to, the filings have been slower, the refunds have been slower, and they've been lower. So overall, there's in February and March, you tend to get a lot of spending related to tax refunds. The amount that has come out in terms of refunds is at least 25% below where it was last year. So there's a lot of factors. We think it's going to stabilize. This is the bottom line. Why is that important? Because if you don't have a lot of layoffs, which we don't in New Hampshire and nationally, and you don't have consumers cutting back spending a lot, it's very hard to have a recession. Because income levels stay relative, they don't drop too much if there's not large numbers of layoffs. And if income isn't falling off, they may cut back on their spending, but it's not being cut back dramatically. And those two factors are critical to maintaining the health of the economy. We don't have a retail sales metric in New Hampshire because we don't have a sales tax, and that's to our benefit. But one of the things that we did during the pandemic is we used a surrogate like we did for the Google Trend search. And one of the surrogates is how many people are dining at restaurants. And we look at a source open table that takes restaurant reservations and measures seatings. People, when they're concerned about the economy and when their finances are strained, one of the first things they cut back on is dining out. This metric shows red line, New Hampshire is always the red line, black line, the US, and blue line, Massachusetts. And it compares the same day in either 2020, 21, 21, or 22 to the same day in 2019 in terms of the number of people who are dining in restaurants at the restaurants that subscribe to Open Table. And what you see is, at least to this point through March, we haven't seen a decline and actually seen growth more than in the US and in Massachusetts. So people are still spending money here. Our overall assessment, our forecast, last year we under forecast job growth. This year we're trying not to make that mistake, but we think job growth is going to slow. It is starting to slow, but we still think that New Hampshire will end up somewhere around 2% employment growth. Our hope is that we, again, under forecast. It's a difficult forecast to make given the uncertainties in the economy. If the Federal Reserve their interest is in cooling the job market. They would like to see job growth slow to zero, but not negative job growth. And there's other issues, credit availability, that will slow the economy, but we still think we'll have positive economic growth. That said, there is a number of threats out there, and this page 16 lists some of the key threats in the economy. Number one, the Federal Reserve just is on has a war on inflation, and they tighten so much that they do kill the job market and result in layoffs. Second one, we assign a probability to that, moderate probability. They seem like they're interested in raising rates again. I don't think they need to. I think the financial markets are doing their work for them. Bank credit crunch could happen, moderate to high probability. Banks are pulling back. They're pulling back because of some of the concerns about the banking industry. Loans are still good. We don't have a banking crisis, but it appears that banks are starting to be more reluctant to make loans, and I'll show you some data on that. Federal debt limit, the federal debt ceiling, if it's not raised and somehow the U.S. were to default on any of its debt, that would have extremely negative. And the ones highlighted in here are the ones that we think are the most dangerous to the economy, the biggest, that could do the most damage to the economy. But we do think that the debt ceiling somehow will get resolved, but that date has been moved up when it becomes a problem. One of the reasons it's moved up is that federal tax filings haven't
been coming in as quickly, and that means the government's taking in less money. That accelerates the date that we run out of money sooner. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it will get harder. I will tell you, it'll get harder. And the first time the U.S. defaults on any of its obligations, a lot of really bad things happen in the financial markets. So we don't think that will happen. Oil prices are always a threat. Generally, I would say a spike in oil prices, and by when I say spike, has to be over $100 a barrel, more likely around $120 a barrel, and have to last for a significant amount of time. I used to say 2 months, 60 days, but I think the economy is questionable enough with inflation already high that it would only take either 30 to 45 days for it to have some real negative impacts. Always a threat. And lastly, kind of the U.S.-China conflict intensifies. New Hampshire has a number of risks. Biggest one, labor force participation continues. These are longer term risks, things that just play into some of the downturn. We know we're struggling with labor force. Our housing supply plays into that. Housing supply is a very big problem. It's a problem because we rely on movement into the state for our population growth. We have very low birth rates. We need people to move into the state for our labor force to grow. That's traditionally how it's grown. But we simply cannot accommodate the numbers of people who have been looking to move into New Hampshire in the last several years. Rich will take over for a bit.
And getting back to our conversation on labor force, so slide 17 shows you where New Hampshire currently stands along with Massachusetts and the country as a whole in terms of labor force recovery coming out of the pandemic. The country as a whole is back above where they were. New Hampshire continues to lag behind. So we're down about 15,000 employed individuals in the state. It's important to note when we look at this information showing 15,000 fewer people indicating that they are working when surveyed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. How do you square that with the employer survey that showed we were significantly up in terms of private payroll? So they are two separate surveys. The household survey, which is the basis of the labor force, and the unemployment rate is New Hampshire residents, not necessarily New Hampshire workers, right? We have 120,000 people that do travel out of state to work, whereas the employer survey is New Hampshire establishments, New Hampshire employers, New Hampshire jobs, but not necessarily New Hampshire residents. So those are some important distinctions between the two. But you can see here, from a labor force perspective, New Hampshire continues to be constrained with supply. The demand is there in the slides that Brian has talked about with job postings and looking at that data, but the supply continues to lag. A lot of that is in those younger cohorts like we've discussed, but it's about a 15,000 person delta in the wrong direction when we look at where we were pre-pandemic peak and the number of people employed compared to where we are currently up through March of this year.
Focusing again on some of the threats that I talked about, housing is one. This chart on chart 18 just shows you what's happened to housing building permits, residential building permits. And what you see, we've come through a period of almost 2 decades of very low growth in the number of housing units. We began that time period with a shortage where we continue that shortage. You see a bit of an uptick after the pandemic, but those are permits. And I happen to live in a community where I know there's several hundred permits that are outstanding but haven't even begun yet. So traditionally you see about a 90 to 95% completion rate where permitted units get built. I believe it's lower, not only for that reason, but labor force has been a challenge for a lot of builders, as well as materials and material costs. So continues to be a problem. The big issue that emerged recently is the banking situation. we have kind of struggled or attempted to make sure that people understand that the banking situation that they've read and seen a lot about in the media is not a situation that an imminent threat to New Hampshire, that people need to be not be concerned about the security of their deposits. The concern is that if people become concerned about the safety of their bank, they remove the deposits. And that's in a nutshell why the banks, the SVB and Signature Bank failed, is because people withdrew their deposits. They withdrew their deposits because they weren't insured. Largely weren't insured. I have a chart there that shows the difference between New Hampshire's community banks and SVB. Not a dissimilar situation than Signature Bank. People remove their deposits, and when that happens, banks have to pay. They don't have that cash on hand. So what they have to do is they have to sell assets, loans or securities, and SVB had half of their assets were in securities, half were in government securities, debt securities. Don't want to get into a lecture on finance, but as interest rates rise, debt securities that were purchased with a lower interest rate lose value dramatically, and that's exactly what happened. They had a mismatch between having longer term debt securities at very low interest rates that offered very low interest rates. Interest rates have risen. Those things have very little value. They had tried to sell them. When they try to sell them, they can't get enough money to pay their depositors. Depositors in SVB Bank the average deposit was $1.25 million, meaning well above the insured amount of $250,000. That's not the case in New Hampshire banks. Again, we want to make it very clear to people that it's important that people not panic in the New Hampshire banking situation. Community banks in particular have seen some, not nationally have seen some people take out deposits. And when that happens, lending to local communities and local businesses is harmed. In order to make loans, they have to have deposits. And when deposits shrink, that means their ability to lend shrinks. So we're been very concerned about that. We haven't seen it yet, thankfully, and we think the banking situation is cooling. Next chart I won't go into, but it just shows the distribution of deposits in New Hampshire. So about almost 2/3 are in large banks, large national regional banks. What we've learned, I think, over the last couple of decades is that no matter what happens to those banks, depositors are going to be made whole. That's just what happens. We hope that's the case with local banks, but we don't think local banks are in a situation where they're going to see a run on their deposits. Lastly, despite all of this, we know that the banking sector overall is healthy. Bank loan officers, this is a national survey, indicate that they are making it more difficult. They're tightening their loan standards across almost all loans. And that's particularly problematic. When that happens, when credit is constricted, generally the economy cools. So they're going to do some of the Federal Reserve's work without Federal Reserve having to raise interest rates. It will also play into one of our key issues, which is housing. Land development, housing development will rely on bank lending and mostly local bank lending. So as credit becomes tighter, that hampers the ability for us to address, the private sector at least, to address the housing availability issue. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Thank you. So I have a couple and might answer some questions. So at the very end, you were talking about the Fed.
Right.
And we know that they just raised the basis points. Projection is they're going to raise them again next month. What's that going to do to our economy, and how's that going to impact things like lending, which is going to probably tighten up even further?
Yeah, well, it has a number of impacts. One, it makes borrowers everything more costly. Anything that is purchased on credit, and that could be, business lending, for capital equipment. It can be consumer loans. Consumer loans
certainly, certainly credit cards have jumped at auto loans. So it has the effect of cooling investment. It has the effect of cooling consumer expenditures. So those are the big, the biggest impact. So credit will be harder to get. Banks will be a little bit less likely to lend. They like the higher rates, but they're concerned about the overall impact on the economy. So there's two factors. There's a lot of factors affecting business lending. One, some loss of deposits. Depositors are moving to sources like that pay higher interest rates. Some of that's non-bank, shadow banks, and that offer higher interest rates. So it will cool the economy. The Fed's, this is my point, that the Fed 25 basis point that they're expecting in May, excuse me, I didn't realize that, is really, from my perspective, unnecessary, because the fact that the other factors that are playing out, the fact that banks are less willing to lend for a lot of reasons, or are making it not more difficult, they're being more cautious in their lending, will cool the economy without the need for those extra interest rates, which are just basically going to take money out of a lot of people's pockets as they have to pay higher rates for everything.
As a corollary to that, I think a reasonable extrapolation would be that our housing market is going to have a more difficult time to grow and get the 20,000 units we need in the state of New Hampshire. It'll be more difficult to find because of the cost to build is going to go up. If you can get the loan, the cost to build is going to go up, which then puts the house priced out of the affordability range of most consumers.
Yeah, the affordability problem is exacerbated by higher interest rates. We know that. The fact that one of the keys to lowering costs is having more supply. The fact that they're not going to be able to build as much because of the lending situation, it all plays into the longer term issues of housing availability and affordability.
So the other question I had was around consumer savings. In the last 18 months, we've seen consumer savings drop pretty dramatically. And at the same time, we've seen consumer debt, credit cards, car loans, go dramatically up. And what's the impact of that going to be?
Yeah, if you look, again, we're looking in the aggregate, consumer credit and credit card lending has definitely increased. It's increased most among lower income households. I spent the last couple of months saying that households are in a better position than they were prior to the last recession. We enter any potential downturn in a better position, with the caveat, and I know I said it to this joint committee before, the caveat is that lower income households are the ones who are relying on credit more than middle and upper income households. Lower income households are always strained in economic downturns. When interest rates rise, they're always hit the hardest. So that most of that, or a good portion of that, is a result of individuals, households in the lower third or so of income having to borrow more to make ends meet.
Thank you. Further questions from everybody? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate it. All right. For the committee, so we're already meeting next week. So not meeting next week. We're meeting the following week on what day was it, Sonia? The 6th? 3rd. On the 3rd, we'll be meeting again. We'll have DRA coming in. I'm trying to find someone from the hospitality industry to come in to have a conversation about hospitality industry and rooms and meals tax, that kind of thing. Although we always have our resident expert over here in the hospitality industry. So trying to do that. My goal is that when we conclude that, we'll have some generic conversation about revenues and what we think they're going to do. And then the following week, we'll probably actually have a revenue work session and hopefully complete all of the revenues that week, the week of the, then you can do the budget. So is there any questions at all? Great. All right, guys. Well, and then we are adjourned.